This is your science recap video for Tuesday and Wednesday, May 4th and 5th, where we finished up our STAR review packet. So we went over the day 4 portion of the review packet, which is mostly 7th grade science, living things. We made sure that we filled everything in. Thursday is your science STAR exam. Remember that this packet is your final exam grade, and your packet is due to your science teacher or in the front office no later than May 11th, and the packet is your exam. Let's look at the day 4 portion of your exam, packet and go over what you learned last year in 7th grade. We started by talking about biotic and abiotic factors. These are different parts of an ecosystem. Ecosystem are simply the living and non-living parts of an environment. We could also say the biotic and abiotic parts of an environment. So biotic means living or once living. So maybe a piece of grass, or a cow, or a mouse, or a wolf, or a bacteria, or a mushroom, any living thing. Abiotic, non-living, never living. So rocks, sunlight, dirt, air, water. We also reviewed how energy flows throughout an ecosystem. Autotroph, those are plants or producers. Auto is automatic. They do it themselves. They make their own food. Heterotroph, hetero means different. They rely on something different for their energy. These are animals or consumers. Predator eats other animals for energy. So, for example, a predator might be a hawk. Prey gets eaten by other animals. For example, a hawk might eat a mouse. We could also talk about energy with symbiotic organisms like parasitism. Parasite, small animal that lives on or in a host. Whereas the host is negatively affected by a parasite. Parasites might be things like lice, leech, botfly. There are lots of gross ones. We can look at food chains to show the flow of energy. Notice the arrow goes in the direction of the energy. So any food chain, we always start with plants or the producer. So in the first one, we have that flower. That plant is producer. The producer, the plant, passes its energy onto the first consumer. Primary means first. So here my mouse is my primary consumer. That then gets eaten or passes its energy to the secondary consumer. The energy then gets transferred to the word tertiary, which means third consumer. So if you forget that, you could even just say third consumer. We'll know what you mean, tertiary consumer. Those same labels apply to a food chain in an ocean or water ecosystem. Phytoplankton, these are microscopic plants. That's our producer. Did you know that 50% of the oxygen we breathe is actually from plants in the ocean? Those producers get eaten by primary consumer. So in this case, our krill is our first or primary consumer. That gets eaten by a secondary consumer. In this case, the chinstrap penguin. That will then pass its energy along to our third or tertiary consumer, the seal in this case. So the arrows go in the direction that the energy goes, always. Which of the following will most likely happen to a predator population if its prey population decreases? So it loses food. If it loses its prey, it's losing a food source. So if that happens, there would be a decrease in the predator population over time. There would be less of them. How many primary or first consumers are in the food web pictured? We have to look at the food web and think about who's eating plants. Primary consumers eat plants. So my strategy is I find the plants and I go to my arrows. So grass gives energy to grasshoppers. So a grasshopper is one primary consumer. But grass also gives energy to rabbits. So rabbits is another primary consumer. The blackberry bush, that's a plant or a producer. That gives energy to the oriole. That's a type of bird. So that's primary consumer. Even though the oriole does sometimes eat the grasshopper, sometimes it's a secondary consumer. It also could eat the aphid. But the blackberry bush going directly to the oriole means that sometimes the oriole is a primary consumer. The blackberry bush also gives energy to the rabbit, but we listed that already. And our last producer, our tree, gives energy to an aphid, which are microscopic or tiny little bugs. Sometimes they live in your garden. So 1, 2, 3, there are 4 primary consumers. Here I have a partial marine food web. Green crabs carry a parasitic worm that can infect organisms that prey on the crabs. Which organism is most likely to be affected by this parasite? So here's my green crabs. Who preys on them? They give their energy to the gulls. So the gulls would be most likely affected. Here we have a food web. Notice again that we really want to pay attention to the direction the arrows are going. What organism or organisms would be impacted if carrots were removed from the food web? Explain. So here's my carrots. Let's remove them. Anytime you remove something on a food web, look at the arrows that are directly connected to it. So the arrows, the carrots give energy to the grasshopper, so the grasshopper would be affected. The carrots also give energy to the rabbit, so both of those would be affected. So grasshopper or rabbits, if they lose a food source, they would decrease. So decrease because they lose a food source. Bald eagles eat rabbits and lizards. What would the impact on this ecosystem be if bald eagles were introduced? Explain. So bald eagles eat rabbits and lizards. That's eagle. So what would happen? It's important to really answer the question directly and think about the first impact, because as you probably know, ecosystems are interconnected and you mess one thing up and they all get messed up. But let's go for the most direct answer. The rabbits and the lizards would decrease because they gain a predator. We could continue. If there are less rabbits and less lizards, that means that there's probably more grasshoppers. A broadleaf herbicide or weed killer is applied to the ecosystem. Which consumers are least affected? Explain your answer. So broadleaf herbicide is going to kill the broadleaf weeds. Who is least affected? Well, the broadleaf affects the deer because deer eat it. It also affects the rabbit because the rabbits eat it. So that means the wolf are probably going to be affected as well because they're directly connected to the deer and the rabbit. The grasshopper and the lizard are not very connected. They don't get energy from the broadleaf leaves. They don't eat those. They don't get energy from broadleaf weeds. If deer were removed, what plant would be most affected and why? So if I get rid of the deer, and I'm going to use a different color on this one. If I get rid of the deer, which plant is most affected and why? So the deer get energy from the oats, but the plant's still eaten by rabbits and grasshoppers. The deer get energy from the ryegrass, but those are also consumed by rabbits. The deer get energy from the broadleaf weeds, but those are also consumed by rabbits. But leaves of trees, nobody else consumes those. So leaves of trees, only the deer eat it. Only the deer consume it. So they're probably going to increase. You're going to have lots of tree leaves. Right? We talked about environmental changes and changes to the environment that might cause certain traits or characteristics to get wiped out or adapt or change. So thinking about natural selection. Long-term changes. If there is a volcanic eruption, it takes a long time for the ecosystem to recover from that. You have to go through primary succession and build soil and then go through all of the different types of succession to get back to what it originally started at. Nuclear meltdown. We actually just came up on the 10-year anniversary of Fukushima in Japan, where that nuclear power plant was affected by the earthquake and then tsunami about 10 years ago. It takes a long time for an ecosystem to recover. There's a show called Chernobyl on right now that kind of shows you the same thing. Climate change is a long-term change to our environment that can affect populations over time. Tectonic plates are also long-term changes. The rest of these could be considered long. It kind of just depends. Generally, an oil spill is kind of a shorter term thing. It's not going to affect the population or the gene pool or like certain traits, but it could if it's there for a really long time. Same thing with floods, seasons, pesticides. Sometimes pesticides do persist or stay in an environment for a really long time, but usually it's a short-term thing because we spray them every season or every year. Fire is a pretty short-term change. Hurricane and drought, usually you can recover pretty quickly from those. Drought, though, I mean, it might be a very long drought, and maybe then it would fit into that long-term change. We reviewed the important structures and functions in cells. So structure just means part. Organelle means like mini organ. So we reviewed these main organelles and their jobs. The cell membrane is kind of like the gatekeeper or the bodyguard. It is permeable, meaning it lets things in and out of the cell. It lets in nutrients. It lets waste out. It keeps bad things like bacteria out. The cytoplasm is this gel-like substance that everything kind of floats around in. It's kind of like Jell-O. Our nucleus is considered the brain or the boss of the cell. It has our genetic information. Our DNA is found on chromosomes. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria provides energy through cellular respiration. The vacuole is storage. Mostly water, but it can store starches and nutrients and stuff as well. Protects and support the cell, maybe cell membrane, but now it says found only in plant cells. That is the cell wall, this extra layer of support beyond the cell membrane. Converts radiant or light energy into chemical energy or glucose, plant cells only. That is the chloroplast. That is describing the chemical change called photosynthesis. Plant and animal cells differ, and we can compare and contrast them. So we might have animal and plant. Plant cells have chloroplasts, and animal cells do not. That is the structure that does photosynthesis. Plant cells have a cell wall, that extra thick layer of support that animal cells do not. Both cell types have a cell membrane. That is that thin, flexible layer that kind of just holds it all together. Both cell types have cytoplasm, that kind of jello-like fluid that everything floats around in. Both cell types have DNA and a nucleus. Your DNA is your genetic information, your genes, and it's contained in the nucleus. Because plant cells have a cell wall, they have this rigid or not flexible square shape. They look like little bricks. Animal cells don't have a cell wall, so they are more flexible. They have a round shape. So which of the following parts of a plant cell has a function, that means job, most similar to the function of an animal skeleton? So the job of animal skeleton is to support the body and hold it up and protect our internal organs. In plants, they don't have a skeleton, but each cell has a cell wall. Muscle cells need to quickly convert energy from food molecules into a usable form. For this region, which of the following do muscle cells have in greater numbers? So what converts and makes energy? That powerhouse, the mighty mitochondria. So muscle cells have more mitochondria than other types of cells. We have a cell shown here. What is evidence that it is a plant and not animal cell? It has a huge vacuole. Plants can't just get up and walk to the sink or the river if they're thirsty. They need to store it somewhere, that extra water, so they have a large vacuole. How is a skin cell from a mouse similar to an amoeba? Well, all cells need energy. We also did just a very general review of 10 major human body systems. And don't get hung up on the details. You should be able to recognize the obvious body systems, such as heart, blood vessels, transporting minerals. That is going to be our circulatory system to circulate materials, oxygen, and waste throughout the body. Exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide gases. The organs, the big ones are lungs, your bronchial tubes. That is your respiratory system, your breathing. Breaking down food into usable form, your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines. That is your digestive system. To remove waste from your blood, like your kidneys, bladder, your urethra, that is your excretory system. To excrete means to get rid of. So we excrete waste. To send messages throughout our body, our brain, our spinal cord, those are part of the nervous system. Think stimulus and response. Regulates body functions, hormones, so different glands that we have. That is part of our endocrine system. Protects and covers internal structures, like our skin, our sweat glands. That is called the integumentary system. To produce offspring, male have testes and female have ovaries. We need our reproductive system. It helps the species continue. Allows the body to move. Our muscles are part of our muscular system. And then shape and support, protecting internal organs, storing needed materials, making blood cells, allowing movements. Our bones are part of our skeletal system. Which part of the human body is most complex? So remember that cells form groups of like cells that work together, like a team made of tissue. Tissues work together to make a group of tissues working together and make an organ. Those make up an organ system. Organ systems function together to make you, an organism. So the most complicated thing, well, organism is not a choice, but our nervous system is, so an organ system. The diagram shows a major system of the human body. What best describes this? I see our trachea, our windpipe, our mouth, our nose, our lungs. This is breathing. This is our respiratory system. What is the job or function of our respiratory system? To exchange gases with the environment.